we left you with the task of finding some cutout people and to experiment and about inserting people. Again, we're going to use the just the same techniques that over and over again in some sense. But today, what I'm going to do is show you a little bit about how to insert people and then modify them a little bit to, because you're not going to find always the right kind of lighting on a person, for instance, or some of these types of things. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you can manipulate that. So one of the things, the first things, if you've done some web searching, there's lots of images for people out there. Some of you might have gotten picked out images, but they either have like a white or a black background, and when you bring them in, it doesn't actually cut. And the same thing goes with your renderings. So you might have out of Rhino not rendered something without a sky or a background that came in black or white, and it's not transparent. So a function of that is the file format that you're using. So JPEG is a file format that you might have been saving things in, and it does not have what's called an alpha channel. So an alpha channel is the transparency. So JPEG does not save information in terms of what is transparent and what's not transparent. That is why PNG file format is kind of preferred for the type of work that we're doing. So because it maintains that alpha channel, that transparency. What you want to do is when you're looking at doing searches for people and things like that, you want to search for PNGs as a file type, and you can type in Google file type :PNG, and it will actually start to separate out PNG files from JPEGs and things like that. Now, if you do have something that has that black background, you can use the magic wand selection tool and just select that black and either turn it into a layer mask or delete that and resave it as a JPEG or a PNG, I mean. So you can modify that. And in Rhino, when you are putting together the rendering and you want maybe the background and everything to be transparent, you can go into the render settings, and in the background there's a checkbox that you can click, which is transparent background. So when you're rendering, but you have to save it as a PNG, so to maintain that transparency. So just a couple of things there. So what we're going to do, I'm assuming one of your assignments was to find some people and to save them into your folder so that we could start work today. And so we're going to jump right in and add a person in here and then do some modifications. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new layer, and I'm going to double click and add people. And so that's pretty much an immediate first thing that I'm going to do. And then the next thing I'm going to do is do what we did with the background and everything. So we'll go to File, Place Linked, and I've already saved a person. So it comes in, and it's coming in as kind of a smart object. So that means that I can scale it and it'll maintain the resolution a little bit. So one of the things you'll notice here about this one is fairly easy. And I chose this for a couple of different reasons. One is that you'll notice that the light is close, but it's not exactly perfect. It's coming from more kind of the back side, which is good. So but I can tweak it a little bit because the shadows in that are a little bit more, they're not as defined as some of the shadows here. So if I put this person in here, it's not going to be bad, but we can improve that a little bit. So one of the things that that you want to do is, it might save you a little bit of time if you are a little bit pickier about where the light kind of comes from. And if you start to organize your entourage as you start to save these things and create file folders that, you know, talk about backlit people, lights coming from different sides, and start to create your archive that's related to that, that saves you some time, because you can tweak these things, and I'll show you how to do that here in a second. But you know, it's not always the best use of your time, for instance. Okay, so I'm just going to put this person in here, and I'm going to save. I'm going to keep this person at a fairly large size at the moment because I want to work on it. Hit enter, and so now this person is a giant walking in our landscape here. And I'm going to do a few things to this, adding some layers that are just associated with this person. So what I want to do right now is just organize my file, and I'm going to create a folder called the backpack person, and I'm going to drag and drop this person into that folder. So now I can do some things that that make this work. So the first thing I want to do is maybe tighten up these shadows, get a little bit more contrast in here. So the first thing that I'm going to do, there's a couple of different ways that we can do it, but probably the easiest, I don't know if it's, I mean, you could use hue and saturation, you can use exposure, you could use levels. Let's try exposure for a moment. And so what I'm going to focus on is just kind of shadows. And I'm looking at the shadows, and I'm looking at how dark the shadows are here. That gives me a sense of how much exposure I want to change. So basically, let's go back here. I'm going to go back to this level here, and I'm going to use the magic wand tool and select around this person. So it collects pretty much everything around. And then I'm going to, you can do two things. You can use Control or Command I, or you can go to Select and Inverse. And so now it's just going to be around that person. And I'm going to create a layer mask. And all I'm doing is I'm going to drag. I want this to be applied over to here. So all I'm going to do is click and drag until it's highlighted and drop. And then I'm going to say, yes, replace that layer mask. Then I'm double clicking on this to bring up the exposure value. And you can see now that it's just going to work on the exposure here. So what I'm going to do is just look at making sure that the dark areas are kind of the darkness that I want. That seems about right. There's not a super science to it. A lot of this is just your eye, developing your eye. Okay, so I'm going to start with that. Then I'm going to click into this layer mask, and I'm going to go over and to a brush. And I'm just going to find just a soft round brush for now. And then what I want to do is I want to paint black. So I'm going to paint back in the highlights. But I want to make sure that my opacity, that I build this up a little bit at a time. So I'm going to set my opacity at like 15 and the flow at about 50. And I'm going to use the bracket keys next to the P, just to the right of the P, to be able to increase and decrease the size. And all I'm going to do here is come in and start to paint back in so you can see how it's just highlighting this piece. And again, it's just, you have to develop a sense for how light plays. That's one of the just a skill that you're going to have to develop a little bit over time. And now I can switch over to a hard-sided brush, because where the shadows are going to be close to like the backpack and that, it's going to be a little bit harsher. So I'm not changing the opacity in that, but I basically want to come in here and tighten up that edge just a little bit. Improve a little bit of contrast. Making this thing smaller, picking up some of these highlights. So this same technique that you're seeing here can be used to change the light and shadow of your regular, almost any image. So if I wanted to go back into the building itself and start to develop that, I can do that. So you're just imagining where the light is falling based on where the light is coming from, and just highlighting those areas. I'm going to spend too much more time on that, but I just want to show that idea. So now I'm going to select this bigger container, and I'm going to scale this down. And by selecting it in the folder, it's going to scale down the both the layer mask and everything with it. So remember, we were talking about how we find that viewpoint in that horizon line. So the horizon line is somewhere around here, and what I'm trying to do is just find what seems to be about the right kind of place. So if you go up to the rulers up here, you can click and drag down while holding down, and you can drag down basically a construction guide that gives you kind of a sense of maybe where the horizon is. It's not going to show up on your image when you save it or anything. It's just a way of kind of developing a guide for you. So I'm going to move, let's say, so the next piece of this is trying to think about how you want to develop and use your entourage to tell the story. So if I put this person over here, our eye just keeps slamming. Oops. Oops, what did I do? Our eye will continue to kind of go off of the page. But maybe what we really want to do is start to bring interest back into the center. And using people in that is a really good way of bringing people into that center. So I'm just going to drag this person over and place him into this scene. Try to get him at the right scale for the space. And so there's a couple of things that I'm doing that you may not notice what I'm doing, but it's kind of important, is that I'm looking at what's going on in the background. So I have these strong verticals here that are lighter. If I put the person right there, you see how it kind of completes that line, but it doesn't separate, it doesn't provide, it's not a good composition to have alignments like that. So when you're looking at different elements and different contrasts, usually you want to look at ways of kind of separating and breaking those alignments a little bit. So I'm going to just place that person right about here. Seems to be about the right scale, doing the right kind of thing. So the next thing I'm going to do is start to add a shadow. So we see that there's a shadow that's coming off and going into this place here. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to duplicate this layer. So I just right-clicked, duplicate layer. And now I have another one. So using Control-T, that's the transform. So now I can move this thing over. And what I want to do is double-click. Oh, I gotta hit Enter. And I want to rename this Shadow. And I'm going to drag this down below. So when I was telling you that that you generally don't want to change and to modify these layers permanently, this might be the one exception where you can probably go ahead and do that. So if you're going to do shadows, we can do the whole layer mask and do all of that, but since we're working in kind of black, the whole point is to kind of turn this black and then maybe adjust it via the layer. That's where you can go up to these adjustments, for instance, and maybe suggest exposure. Just make it black. That's probably okay. So now the next thing that I want to do is to now adjust it. So I'm going to do Edit, and I'm going to go down to the Transform menu, and I'm going to use Distort. So the first thing I'm going to do is just think about, we have some long shadows here, so we're going to kind of create these long shadows, and just kind of tweak, move it over, zoom in here a little bit so we can kind of see what's happening. And you have to kind of imagine, so this person's foot is up and the shadow is going to come down kind of forward of the foot a little bit. There might be a little bit underneath. The angle of the shadow here kind of tells us the angle that we need, which we're probably pretty good at. I'm using the space bar to get the hand to move. Just tweaking it a little bit. Okay, that's probably pretty good. Then I'll hit enter. So I have a little bit of a shadow here. So this is where we can start to look at creating these darkening kind of features. So we want to change the opacity, kind of change the, so we can use darken, we can use multiply, and you'll notice that because it's black, it's pretty much not changing anything. But we can adjust the fill. We can adjust the opacity. But what I want is to try to match as best I can the color and the opacity of this. Okay, so that gets us pretty close to there, but you'll notice that this is doubling over, and in a real shadow you don't have like shadows multiplying on shadows, right? So what we can do is just simply make sure that our layer is selected that we're working on. Go to our selection polygon selection tool and select that, and so we made that layer mask, but we want to invert it because it's cutting off the opposite. So if I just make sure the layer mask is selected and Command or Control I, and we get somewhat close. And so now we can kind of see that we have a little bit of tweaking that we're going to need to do to make this happen. And that's fine because we can just adjust that here. So you have that pretty close. So the next thing you notice is that if we look at these shadows, there's it gets blurrier the further away you get, and that's called penumbra. And there's a couple of different ways that you can do it. I don't know if you really need to get into that level of detail, because if you're zooming back at you know, around 100%, it's probably working fine. So part of the trick of learning how to render and make these images is understanding what level of detail that you need to put together to make that happen. And for this, since it's a person and it's going into the shadow, I'm probably not going to spend too much more time on that to make that happen. Okay, so we have the person in here, and we have it's working pretty well. One other thing that that can happen that might be interesting is you can apply some different filters to these images, and so let's go to filter gallery. So I'm going to go to blur and go to motion blur. So some techniques you might want to look at are how you can make people and things appear a little bit in motion, and so you can imagine that that a person is in motion and kind of tweak that. But you can also use, again, apply this filter, but use it in a layer mask and apply it to just like the legs or just like the arms in order to develop that. So there are some options. There's a couple of YouTube videos on how to do this in the visualizing architecture. So I'm just going to show you basically this is how you would start to go about it. Look up, if you're interested in doing that, look up those that website and get into it a little bit more. Okay, so what I want to do is spend the rest of, now that you've got the basics, let's spend the rest of the class period working on adding some people and entourage and making sure that they're scaled properly and that they are starting to work in your composition. And the TAs and I, if you have questions, we'll go around and help you out with that.